Hey gang, this is Mr. Hefner again, and today we're going to take a look at some of the characters who are on the Union side. They fought for the North, they wore the blue uniforms, and we're still in our introduction to our unit on the Killer Angels. There are going to be a lot of characters today, and remember that because this is a video, you can always pause it to take notes or copy something down. You can slow it down, although that will make my voice sound really funny. So it's probably best to pause it from time to time. You have a character packet. You can keep Cornell notes if you like, but the character packet will count as Cornell notes. And all the characters that are important for the novel are listed there with some information, and you'll be providing more as we go. Remember, you'll be adding notes from these videos, which is the background knowledge that I'm providing for you. And then as you read the novel, you have a responsibility to continue to add more observations as you see them in the fictional work. So let's get started here. First off, I wanted to show you the flag that would be flying for the Union Army at this time. Looks an awful lot like our flag does today. And you'll notice that in the canton, right here, the canton is the blue section close to the flagpole. You'll notice that the number of stars is different than what we see today. We're not 50 stars at the time of the Civil War. You'll also notice that there are stars here even for Confederate states. Congress, some members of Congress anyway, at the time of the Civil War, wanted to remove stars for states that basically seceded from the Union and formed a Confederacy. Abraham Lincoln refused to ever accept that another country existed. He believed that those states were always part of the Union, they were always part of the United States, and he insisted that their stars remain on the flag. All right, one of the first Union characters that you meet in the novel is General John Buford. Now, Buford is one of those guys who was in the Army long before the Civil War started. So the Civil War is a different kind of war in that most of the soldiers are volunteers. At the time the Civil War started, the armies were small. We needed more people, and people who had not been trained to be soldiers signed up, got quick training, and next thing you know, they found themselves on the battle line. John Buford was a cavalry commander, cavalry coming from the Spanish root for horse. He was a cavalry commander for a long time before the Civil War came along. So he has previous experience, and he fought in the wars with the Native Americans in the Midwest and the West. And of course, those are battles in which you don't line up across the battlefield and shoot at one another as the European style of fighting for armies had been. And so he has techniques that he's learned that he's going to bring to the Battle of Gettysburg, and Mike Shara, the author, is going to capitalize on these here. Now, Michael Shara portrays this guy in our book as somebody who's disgusted with Army politics, and certainly during the time of the Civil War, Army politics were a problem for the North. There were what were known as political generals. Generally, they were Democrats, which was the anti-war party, but they were still supporting the war effort. And Abraham Lincoln believed he needed to do something to keep them on his side. And so many times in the Northern Army, in the Union Army, you found generals who really were not very well qualified to be leading men, and they made some downright stupid decisions from time to time. Now, at Gettysburg, as you start in the Killer novels, you're going to find that it's Buford who arrives and decided that this is beautiful ground. When he describes it as beautiful ground, he doesn't necessarily mean that the vegetation is lovely, but he means it's a perfect place to fight a battle because it's got certain areas of high ground. High ground is going to be really important as a defensive strategy in this book. And each area of high ground is backed up by another area of high ground. And so if he places troops and they're forced to retreat, instead of losing the good ground, they actually get to retreat to even better ground. And so Buford gets a lot of credit for choosing Gettysburg as the place for this battle. Now, Buford's not going to live out the year. This isn't necessarily important to the reading of the novel, but just something to understand this character. Buford's not going to live out this year. In 1863, he fights the Battle of Gettysburg in July, and December of that same year, he's going to die of a fever. And while he's on his deathbed, Abraham Lincoln is going to promote him to Major General. Now, this gets a little confusing sometimes because if you look at him in his picture there and you can see his shoulder epaulets, you'll see there's one star. That one star means that he's a brigadier general. That's the lowest ranking type of general. And Abraham Lincoln's going to promote him to Major General in December, but that promotion is effective back to the Battle of Gettysburg. So sometimes you'll see him listed as Major General, and sometimes you'll see him listed as Brigadier General. In reality, he was a Major General that day as far as the paperwork is concerned, but everybody on that day saw him as a Brigadier General. One of our most, probably, now I'm not even going to say one of, our most important Union character in this book is going to be this guy right here, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. This guy is nothing short of amazing. He is the Benjamin Franklin, if you think it, if you want to accomplish it, just work hard and you can do it kind of guy. So at the time he signs up to fight in the Army, he's a professor at Bowdoin College in Maine, a very good college, very expensive college today. And he actually asked his department head, may I have a sabbatical so that I can go fight in the war? And he was turned down. They told him, no, sorry, you're a professor. Professors don't fight battles. And Chamberlain, in sort of a slightly, maybe very deceptive move, he then put in for a sabbatical to go study in France. Instead, they granted him the sabbatical and he immediately went off and joined the war effort. He is an autodidact, one of these self-educated people like Abraham Lincoln. Grew up on a farm, didn't have access to the finest educations, but he read books and worked very hard. In fact, when he wanted to get into Bowdoin College, he didn't meet their entrance requirements because one of the things he didn't qualify for was he could not read, write, and speak Hellenic Greek. That's the ancient Greek language of Homer. And in 1 year, without the use of Duolingo, he taught himself how to do that and finally got into the college. So when he signs up for the Army, he's offered command of the 20th Maine Regiment. He turns it down with the belief that he doesn't have enough military background, and he becomes the lieutenant commander under a colonel named Ames. By the time Gettysburg comes along, Ames has been promoted, and that means that Chamberlain gets to be the new commander of the 20th Maine. And so he's new to command at this point as the novel's getting started. Sometimes he's called the hero of Little Round Top, and I don't want to put any spoilers in here, but watch the book carefully for where that title comes from. It's going to be really obvious, and I don't need to explain it. Other people also get called the hero of Little Round Top, and we'll talk about that later in this unit. After the war was over, and Chamberlain had been wounded several times during the war. The one time he was wounded so badly it was thought he was going to die, and it took months till he came back to the battlefield. But because he was so well educated and so well spoken, he became an author who was much in demand after the war. And he wrote about everything in his war experience. He wrote a great book called The Passing of the Armies, which tells the story of the final days of the war. He spoke many times at dedications of monuments. He wrote articles for newspapers, and in particular, he wrote about the Battle of Gettysburg, and we'll be taking a look at some of his writings later on in this unit. Now, by the end of the war, even though he went in with no military experience, he was a major general. When he was thought to be dying, General Grant made one of only 2 battlefield promotions in his time as commander of all the Union armies, and he promoted Chamberlain to Major General, the highest rank at that time. After the war was over, Chamberlain he ran for governor of Maine. He was elected to 4 terms, and he worked his way all the way up to president of Bowdoin College. Chamberlain, while he was there at Bowdoin, taught every subject they had except for mathematics, and then he became president. So this is a guy who, his credentials are pretty impressive. And in 2019, while I was in Maine, I decided to stop at the little cemetery where Chamberlain is buried. And I don't know if you can see it past, if you look through the space between the 2 headstones there, you'll see a little chain link fence. The other side of that chain link fence is actually the campus of Bowdoin College. So Chamberlain is buried here in this family plot with his wife Fanny and his children. Now in the book, you're going to find another character, another Chamberlain, Lieutenant Thomas Chamberlain. Tom is actually the younger brother to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. So they come from the same family in Maine. They're going to be close together. One of the things you want to look for as you read this book is the relationship between these two brothers. Uh, with Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and by the way, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain went by the name Lawrence because his father was also Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and he went by Joshua. So I'm going to start just calling him Lawrence Chamberlain here, if I remember to do that. Lawrence Chamberlain's the older brother, and he has sort of a family obligation to protect his younger brother. So he keeps his younger brother as his aide de camp, which basically means he takes care of all the paperwork and details and things like that. Tom's basically going to be a secretary to his older brother. And he's actually one of three brothers who are at the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, the third brother, John, doesn't get mentioned in the novel because he's not fighting. He's working with a group called the uh, oh gosh, what is the name? It's a civilian organization which sort of works like the USO does today. They travel around with the army and do anything they can to make the soldiers comfortable. They bring them care packages from home. They work as nurses. They entertain them. There were two organizations that did this, and to be honest, right now I'm not sure which one John won. One was called the U.S. Christian Commission, and the other was called the U.S. Sanitary Commission. But they both did the same kinds of services for soldiers. And then we have one character, interesting guy, Private Buster Kilrain. And Buster is, I have no picture for him because he didn't exist. Buster is actually the only speaking important character in this novel who's made up. He's our fictional creation. And yet he's kind of interesting. His backstory in the novel is that he used to be a sergeant. He came to this country from Ireland to escape, kind of the oppression and the class structures of Ireland. Came to America for the that Ben Franklin idea of the American dream. And then he found that when he got to America, you really have to fight if you want to get ahead. He got in a fight at some point. He was drunk and he struck an officer in the head with a bottle, and he was demoted down to private. But what's important is he hangs out with Chamberlain. He's older than Chamberlain, and even though Chamberlain has this intellectual background that probably exceeds any other in the novel, Buster Kilrain has that hands-on military experience. Buster Kilrain, like I said, he's an Irish immigrant, has sort of a pessimistic outlook. But in Buster Kilrain, you'll see a lot of characteristics that were actually part of Joshua Chamberlain, the father to Lawrence Chamberlain, Joshua Chamberlain's personality. And we have recordings, not audio recordings, but written recordings of some interchanges that happened between Lawrence Chamberlain and Joshua Chamberlain. And you're going to see some of those words put in Buster Kilrain's mouth as the story goes on. All right, those are our major ones. Other characters coming up here. I'm going to go a little bit faster so this doesn't take your entire day. You've got Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, a dashing soldier and very popular at the time. He's named for Winfield Scott. At the start of the Civil War, Winfield Scott was the commander. I'm sorry, take that back. Before the Civil War, not at the start, but before the Civil War, Winfield Scott made a name for himself commanding U.S. forces in the war against Mexico. At the start of the Civil War, Winfield Scott was still in command of all the Union armies. The problem was he had grown to over 300 pounds, couldn't even get on a horse anymore, and there was no way he was in any shape to go out and fight in the field. Anyway, our character, Winfield Scott Hancock, is he's the new commander of the Second Corps. He's just been promoted, and he doesn't have a whole lot of well, he doesn't have the credentials right now as some of the other commanders. And yet, because he's dashing and bold and can make quick decisions, General Meade is going to send him on ahead and put him in charge of the field. He's going to receive a terrible, terrible wound, which we'll talk about later, on July 3rd, which is the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, and that's going to direct his career from that point on. But that wound that he receives on July 3rd is going to be a key part of our novel. So you might want to write that in your notes and keep your eyes open for that when we get to it. After the war was over, he was a very popular figure. He was a Democrat, but he had been in favor of the war. And so he ran on the Democratic ticket for president, but he was defeated by James Garfield. Maybe a good thing because James Garfield was assassinated not too long after taking office. And Winfield Scott Hancock is fighting in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, as a Pennsylvanian. This is his home country here, this state of Pennsylvania. He's buried today in Norristown, PA, just outside Philadelphia in the suburbs, and that was his hometown. Another famous Pennsylvania that we want to keep our eyes on in this is General George Gordon Meade. Now, Meade is somebody who has a lot of military experience, but he's just recently, only days before the Battle of Gettysburg, he's been put in command of the Army of the Potomac. He hasn't had a chance to pick his officers. He hadn't had the chance to come up with a major battle plan at this point. But the fact that he's a Pennsylvanian, he's a Philadelphian, is important because this battle is being fought in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvanians and Union soldiers are going to, for one of the first times in the battle, it's probably the second major time with the Battle of Sharpsburg the year before, one of only two times up to this point that Union soldiers have had to fight on their own home territory. Meade was a short-tempered man, the kind of guy that if you were the messenger and you brought him bad news, you were sometimes punished for bringing that to him. And his men called him a goggle-eyed snapping turtle. Goggle-eyed because of those bags that he has under his eyes. You can see them in this picture. And a snapping turtle because of his short temper. He's going to win the Battle of Gettysburg. That's a bit of a spoiler, but should be no secret if you paid attention in American history class. But he's going to fail to pursue Lee's army. We'll talk later about why that might have been, but he gets a lot of blame from people, and he even got blame from Abraham Lincoln, who wrote an angry letter that fortunately Lincoln never mailed to Meade. And finally, this is kind of something that even some historians get this wrong when they're not speaking carefully. Meade is going to be the final commander of the Army of the Potomac. So the Army of the Potomac is going to last through the remainder of the Civil War, which is 2 more years after the Battle of Gettysburg, and General Meade is going to command that army to the end. Even Time magazine, on the 150th anniversary of the start of the Civil War, kind of miswrote and said that Meade was later replaced by General Grant. And that's not exactly true. General Grant was placed later on in 1864, was placed in command of all of the Union armies. It's just that Grant chose to shadow Meade and follow him everywhere. And so the two of them were always together for the rest of the war. Grant was in charge of everything. Meade was in charge of the Army of the Potomac. By the way, that funny word Potomac, that is the name of the river that flows through Washington, D.C. In the Union Army, or in the Union, most of the armies were named after important rivers that sort of acted as their base. So that's why you're going to see Army of the Potomac a lot. Now, on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg and the Killer Angels, you're going to meet Major General John Fulton Reynolds, but you're not going to get to spend much time with him. Reynolds is from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Lancaster, Pennsylvania is starting to get pretty close to Gettysburg. He's going to be shot dead on the first day of the battle, but he's one of the most respected soldiers in the Union Army. In fact, most people believe that he was offered command of the entire army, the army that General Meade is commanding, and that Reynolds turned the offer down because he believed that as long as he was going to be given orders by people in Washington, D.C., who were not out in the battlefield, he couldn't be an effective commander. And so he turned that down. He's considered to be the finest officer that's out there. And in fact, in the whole 3 days of the Battle of Gettysburg, he's going to be the most important, highest ranking officer who's killed. And that includes both armies. And there's a great little story about him. I'll tell the short version real quickly right now, but after he died, his body was kind of put in storage for 2 days before it could be sent back home to his family in Lancaster. He was 40 years old, and he was a confirmed bachelor. Many people considered him married to the army. Turned out, when they went to prepare the body, they found that on a chain around his neck was a ring. And there was a mysterious inscription in that ring. Turns out he had become secretly engaged. And we'll hear more about that little engagement later on, but you can go research it if you want. It's a story that's been told again and again and again. Just look Major General Reynolds' engagement, and you will get a very romantic and very sad story. Now, go back to Chamberlain for a moment. So sorry, couldn't say it there. Chamberlain is colonel of the 20th Maine. And the 20th Maine then is grouped together with some other regiments that make up a brigade. And when they arrive at Gettysburg, the commander of the brigade is General Strong Vincent. And yes, Strong is not a nickname. That's actually his first name given to him by his parents at birth. He's a very strong leader. He is a lawyer by training, and he's going to make some of the decisions that affect Chamberlain on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. He's going to be mortally wounded on that day. He's not going to survive his wounds. He's someone else who is going to be wounded as a colonel, and he's going to be promoted to general before he dies. It's probably possible that he didn't even know he was ever promoted to general. When he dies, James Rice is going to take over. Rice doesn't play a significant role in the book other than he gets mentioned, and Chamberlain's going to be told that Vincent is down, meaning he's wounded and out of commission, and that Colonel Rice is now in command. So I just wanted to share his picture with you because he is a real person. Another name that gets mentioned in the Killer Angels. He doesn't play a major role, probably because he could have his own novel if he had a role at all, is Major General Daniel Sickles. Daniel Sickles is a political general, and you'll find lots of historians arguing about just what his role was at Gettysburg and whether he made things better or worse on that day. But he is a politician at his very heart. Tammany Hall was a New York political group famous for its corruption, and Sickles was involved in that particular group. The most famous thing about Sickles before the Civil War was that he was living in Washington. He was a representative in the House of Representatives. He had a very young wife, just a teenager. And he became, even though he probably was unfaithful to her on many occasions, he became aware that she was seeing a young man. And so one day, Sickles followed that young man, watched him go into the house, watched him leave the house, and then Sickles chased him down into Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C., which is just across the street from the White House, and Sickles shot him. The man was on the ground, still alive, as people were running to his aid when Sickles pulled the trigger and shot him again, killing him. What's most interesting about this is the man that he killed was named Philip Barton Key. And Philip Barton Key is the son of Francis Scott Key, the man who composed the words for our national anthem. The case went to court, and Sickles argued that he was so jealous that he became temporarily insane. And Sickles actually became the first person in American history ever to be acquitted of murder on a defense of temporary insanity. He was a political general, as I said, and he was sort of a friend of the Lincolns. He could come and go at the White House at any time. Sometimes I shouldn't say misspoke, sometimes he overstepped in his speaking. At one point, the Lincolns had Mrs. Lincoln's sister staying there. Mrs. Lincoln's sister had been the wife of a Confederate general till he was killed. And Sickles evidently said that that rebel shouldn't be living in the executive mansion. That was the old name for the White House. And Abraham Lincoln pretty much said to him, Mrs. Lincoln and I can choose our own house guests, stay out of our business. So by the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, General Sickles is going to be the commander of the Third Corps Army of the Potomac. And whether he disobeyed or misunderstood General Meade's orders is going to be really important. But he puts his troops in the wrong place. He didn't like some low ground where he was supposed to be placed, put them on some high ground, and ends up causing some of the bloodiest fighting of the second day of the battle. He himself is going to be badly wounded near the Trossel farmhouse. It's the high ground, if you've ever heard of Gettysburg, and places like the Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, the Wheat Field. These are the areas where his troops are fighting on the second day's battle. And a cannonball comes along and strikes him in the leg while he's on his horse. Now, don't worry, the horse was uninjured. So this picture that I have here of General Sickles as a brigadier general is the only picture I know of him where he's standing, because he had his leg amputated after this battle. Sickles was a politician. And after that, anytime he had his picture taken, this is Sickles here in the middle of the picture, every time he had his picture taken, he made sure he was not wearing his prosthetic wooden leg. He had one, but he wanted to remind people of the sacrifice that he made. In fact, if you look on the right side of the picture here, you'll even see his crutches propped up here. Now, the story goes that the cannonball came bouncing along, struck him below the knee in his leg, shattered the bone. The only way to deal with an injury like that in those days was to remove the leg below the knee. That sounds like a really, really radical way of treating the wound, but it actually makes sense. In those days, we didn't have antibiotics, and more people were going to die of infection than from the actual wound. And a shattered bone is an opportunity for a lot of infection. It's a very complicated injury. By amputating, you take that complicated injury and you make it a much more simple injury. It's a single stump. But Sickles' leg was going to be amputated, and the story goes that he told the doctor, and this is probably a made-up story, but the story goes that he told the doctor, if you have to take off my leg, save it. I want to send it to General Meade. Well, we don't know that that ever happened, but we do know that his leg was saved. In fact, this is a picture of the tibia and fibula of General Sickles and the kind of cannonball that would have struck his leg. This isn't the exact cannonball. You can still see this on display at the U.S. Army, excuse me, U.S. Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. And for the rest of his life, General Sickles used to take people to go visit his leg, kind of an odd thing. Now, one of the things that may have been happening at the time was General Sickles was an officer. And so he would have gotten one of the better surgeons to take his leg off. And surgeons were working at the time on amputating legs in a way that created a rounded instead of a flat stump, rounded so that it would fit better into the prosthetic legs that were being made at the time. And if anybody would have had that, Sickles would have. And if this amputation was a good example, it makes sense that the doctor may have sent the leg to Washington. We're not exactly sure why this leg is there. All right, Ellis Spear is he's commanding one wing of Chamberlain's regiment at Gettysburg. And his name's going to come up. You're going to see him in the novel a number of times. He's also educated. He was a teacher at the time, and so he could read and write. And I put him in here only because Chamberlain gives his account of what happens on July 2nd in the novel, and sometimes Ellis Spear's account on that differs. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean Chamberlain was lying. These two men would have been at different parts of the regiment on that day, and orders that were shouted from one person to another often couldn't be heard above all the noise. And so I think it's just important to know that there's more than one account, and we'll have two accounts that are both given by educated men who could write. Daniel Butterfield gets mentioned pretty early on in the novel. He's not terribly important, but Daniel Butterfield is a member of General Meade's staff only because Meade hasn't picked his own staff yet. Butterfield was hand-chosen by General Hooker, who was the previous commander of the Army of the Potomac, and made some huge mistakes at the Battle of Chancellorsville just a little under 2 months earlier. Butterfield loved writing bugle calls. And there's a little part in the book where Tom Chamberlain is talking about General Butterfield and explaining how he wrote a bugle call that goes really well for the 20th, and he even sings it. And he says you can recognize it because he goes, Dan, 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 Butterfield, Butterfield, Dan, 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 Butterfield, Butterfield. And when you would hear that bugle call, you would know that the bugle call that comes next, which is the order, is meant for the 20th Maine. So I give you a picture of Daniel Butterfield here. Like I said, at this point, Meade has to work with him because he doesn't have time to pick a new staff, but they do not get along. And the most famous bugle call that Butterfield ever composed was Taps. And that's the bugle call that's, to this very day, it's played at every military funeral. Other corps commanders who are going to be mentioned in the novel, not completely important to us. One of them is going to be General Abner Doubleday. So when General Reynolds is killed on the first day, Abner Doubleday is the highest ranking officer at that point, and so he temporarily takes command of the whole human, of course they're human, the whole Union Army. Now, the thing that Doubleday is really most famous for is he claimed to have invented the game of baseball. We might not have baseball as such an important sport today if it hadn't been for the Civil War. You know, soldiers might have been in the army for 3 years or more, but they weren't fighting every day. So what do you do to keep busy? Well, they formed teams and they played this new sport called baseball. It was a rough and tumble sport back then. There was no such thing as an umpire, and almost every baseball game ended in a fist fight. But Abner Doubleday claimed that he invented the game and shared the game with soldiers who then, after the war, took it home to their nearby towns where they started playing it. If you have ever been to the Baseball Hall of Fame, you know that it's in Cooperstown, New York, and Cooperstown, New York was Abner Doubleday's hometown. And there's a baseball field at the Hall of Fame called Doubleday Field. So Abner Doubleday got a lot of credit for inventing the inventing the game of baseball for a long time. And then we found evidence that showed that people were playing baseball before Doubleday could have even invented it. So today, we know he's not the inventor. He may have helped to teach the sport and spread the sport and encourage the sport, but we really don't know who invented baseball. Other Corps commanders that we've got here, Oliver Otis Howard of the 11th Corps. The 11th Corps arrives at Gettysburg just after the 1st Corps, and Howard outranks Doubleday, and so he takes command of the field. Howard has just returned to battle. He's missing an arm, and yet he's still commanding on the field here. Howard has a reputation he needs to overcome. He's got a problem in that a lot of the troops he has in his command are German Americans. They came here from Prussia, and they don't even speak English. And their commanding officers do speak English, but they don't speak German. And so he's got some command issues, which you'll hear about as you're reading the book. We then have George Sykes. George Sykes is new to command the 5th Corps. So Sykes will be Chamberlain's direct commander, and you see him at the end of the book, so we're not going to worry too much about Sykes right now. But what's interesting is Sykes has just taken command of the 5th Corps because the previous commander of the 5th Corps was George Gordon Meade, and he's just been promoted to lead the entire Union Army. And then we have Uncle John Sedgwick. He was loved by his men, hence the nickname Uncle. He commands the 6th Corps at Gettysburg, and they are the largest corps on the battlefield. And for the most part, they're going to be held in reserve just in case they're needed. And so we'll talk about that as we go through the book and the battle strategy later on. But I wanted you to have a picture of him. Now, two characters that don't show up in the novel at all, but I just wanted you to know who they are because there's a great story here. One of them is David Gregg. He is commanding the Union cavalry at Gettysburg, and they are going to, on the 3rd day of the battle, they're going to fight a separate cavalry battle a few miles east of the main battle. This cavalry battle that happens is the largest cavalry battle ever fought in the state of Pennsylvania. And under his command is this guy named George Armstrong Custer. And Custer's going to make a name for himself later after the war, fighting in the Indian Wars out west. But Custer is from Michigan, and he's going to shout the famous command at Gettysburg, "Come on, you Wolverines," because he's commanding the Michigan Wolverines. And so if you're a Michigan University fan, you know where the whole Wolverine thing came from. And then finally, another cavalry commander who does not show up in our book, but he's important, is this guy here, Judson Kilpatrick. He was so reckless with men's lives that his own men called him Kill Cavalry instead of Kilpatrick. And he's going to order a pointless charge on July 3rd, uh, where he's going to have cavalry soldiers attacking the retreating Confederate army, and they're going to have to attack while riding horses over a boulder strewn field. It's absolutely ridiculous. Under his command, um, well, we'll get to that later. Yeah, I don't want to do any spoilers right now. This guy was thrown in jail several times. His camps were famous for being unsanitary. He invited prostitutes in. Disease ran rampant. But again, he's a political general. And after he was finally relieved of duty commanding the army to keep him happy, he was given an official government position where he became a United States minister to Chile, which I don't think at the time was a super important position. All right, well, that is our Union characters. Be sure to check Schoology for any additional requirements or assignments or expectations. The next lesson will focus on the Confederate characters. And again, you can continue with your character packet. Thanks for staying with me through the whole thing. And you can always join one of our live sessions with any questions or send me questions via Schoology.